most important one, at least within the school. And so the data on the left is almost certainly not correct. Now, it represents, of course, as we all know, a fundamental and profound culture around teacher evaluation in schools. That is, where most teachers traditionally have expected to be judged at the top of whatever the scale was, and if they weren't, there was something wrong. And so that has been, of course, one of the culture shifts that's had to accompany the large-scale use of my framework for teaching, because then when teachers look at the descriptors at the distinguished level, they realize that that's a heavy lift, and it's hard to teach at that level, certainly consistently. So I think there's an informal acknowledgement of that, but it has yet to be really translated into practice, as we'll see. Now, the little half slide on the right represents the actual results from the MET study, Measures of Effective Teaching, that involved the video capture of 23,000 lessons, as you may know, and the training of literally hundreds of observers who had to not only be trained, they had to be certified. That is, they had to demonstrate their accuracy not only at the outset, but on a daily basis, because otherwise the study itself would not be valid. And so the Gates Foundation and the researchers that were involved in the study insisted on that. And we've learned a lot from that entire process about training, about certification, about ongoing accuracy, and about how important it is. So and you can see on this slide from the MET study, the red on the left represents unsatisfactory performance, the yellow is basic, the light green is proficient, and the dark green is distinguished. And the encouraging aspect of this, that there's not much unsatisfactory level performance. That's very good news. It's not zero, let's point out, but it's not large, taken overall. But the not so good news is that there's very little teaching at the very top level. And let me just remind you, these are levels of performance of teaching, not of teachers. But these represent trained and certified observers assessing performance of massive numbers of lessons, over 100,000. And so it's a lot of data. And that's something we learned from an earlier study done in Chicago, not as big as this, but still large, 100 schools. It showed good, strong correlations between teacher performance and student learning. But the not so encouraging part of that report was that unless and until teaching performance was at the top level, namely distinguished, you didn't get large numbers or large gains in student learning. So this then it illustrates dramatically, in my view, what is truly our challenge, which is that, first of all, the results of, if you did good quality assessment of teaching, you'd almost certainly get, or accurate assessment, you'd almost certainly get results more like the graph on the right than on the left. But, that's not enough. I mean, you can do that, and you can figure out where people are on this sort of bell curve more accurately than you would have done previously. But if that's all we do, collectively, we haven't done much. And so, but then all we've done is label people more accurately. What we have to do is actually move the curve. We as educators have to be able to help teaching literally improve. Otherwise, as I say, we simply haven't done much. And so, 10 years from now, the quality of teaching, if it hasn't really moved, if the extent of student learning has not improved, I think the public could be forgiven for asking us what we did actually with all that money. That I don't think we have a choice. And I'm sure you don't either. So, okay. So then what does that mean? Well, first of all, just as a little reprieve here of the MET results, the MET results did underscore the need for feedback and the role of accuracy in giving that feedback. First of all, you can see that on that 4-point scale, my 4-point scale, 88% of people were in the middle, 2s and 3s. And we'll talk more about that distinction in a little bit, but very few at the 1, thankfully, not very many at the 4 either. And that's where we are obliged, in my view, to do better, fundamentally, do better, which means then that we have to think seriously about the systems for educative processes, not just that is, accuracy is important for high-stakes evaluation. If you're going to make consequential decisions about teachers and their careers, you have to be accurate. There's no doubt about that. But that's the first purpose, and ultimately the more important purpose for the long-term health of public education is that teaching improve and that kids learn better. So, okay, now the mechanism that we worked out through the MET study and then through the extension of the MET study into the proficiency system that I and ETS have worked with Teachscape to do has to do with the rationales for accuracy. The next slide shows that the heart of the training program that we developed together, initially for MET and then afterwards for anybody who wants it, are some sample videos at each level of performance for each component, illustrating the really what it looks like at that level. And this one happens to be for engaging students in learning. There are, as for all components, 2 benchmark, in this case level 3s, and not only a video that shows that level of performance, but the critical part is the rationale. Why is this a level 3 a proficient level rather than some other level of performance? And it is this rationale and the sort of the integration of this way of thinking into observers' repertoire that then gives them the tools they need for professional conversations with teachers and to structure those conversations so that they are meaningful and productive for teachers. And it has not only to do with here's what you did well and not well, but it has to do also with engaging teachers in that conversation to involved in those processes that we know from research really do support teacher learning, and that those are fundamentally self-assessment, reflection on practice, and professional conversation. And so these rationales then give the raw material for that. So now that we've had some experience with this, we can ask, okay, how's it going? How's it going? How are the early states doing? Well, the short answer to that question, unfortunately, is not all that well so far. But it's early days, let's remember that. And so this is a reprint of the EdWeek article of just a couple of weeks ago by Stephen Sawchuk, who, and it's sort of highlighted here in blue, in Michigan, 98% of teachers were effective or better. In Florida, 97%. In Tennessee, 98%. Georgia, 94%, and so on. And of course, in many of these places, the ratings were not only based on observation of classroom practice, but also on some formulation of value-added student learning scores. So it's a complicated picture, and it's not the same everywhere. But bottom line, that the ratings are still extremely high and probably don't reflect reality. It's hard to know for sure because we don't have an independent measure, but my guess is, everybody's guess is, that we're probably still operating under some of the same ways of thinking that we have always done. So, and here's the same data shown in graphically, and you can see the blue bars represent the results from the widget effect. That is, you can see virtually nothing at unsatisfactory, not very many basic, and so on, up to distinguished. The MET study is in red, which shows more of a distribution of performance that you would expect statistically. And the green are the early states. That is their distribution of scores, and it's more dramatic and more pronounced than the widget effect, which has to give us all pause. Because if all we're doing, if we're going through all this time spent, effort spent on training, and hopefully not yet certification, and we're still getting the same results, we have to question it. So then, therefore, we have to think, well, what could be causing that? What are the sources, possible sources of this score inflation? And there are a lot of possibilities, of course, mostly reflecting the fact that most states are pretty early out of the gate on these new systems. And so not only are people stuck in some of their old ways of thinking and their skill set, which is not fully developed, but also they don't want to go out on limbs when they're not sure. So there are old data systems. There are a lot of people have been, as we say, stress testing their systems. That is, most of these systems are due to go live and consequential pretty soon. And most of them have not been so far, which then most people think, well, okay, it doesn't really matter. Falsely inflated BAM scores. The fourth bullet there illustrates and describes a phenomenon that maybe some of you all are familiar with. A lot of people take my framework and other instruments, I'm sure, and they look at them and they say, oh, this is pretty good, but I'd like to tweak it a little bit. And so they do. And I discourage it when I can, only because I'm more aware than probably most other people on the planet of how hard it is to do that well, to write rubrics that in fact are reliable and valid. And the framework for teaching with the existing rubrics